Hey everyone, Jim Branscombe here for the Cinematic Void vlog. Doing another top 10 list for January Giallo, but this one's a little different because I'm not focusing on the Giallo films that were produced in Italy. I'm actually going to be talking about some of my favorite Giallo Adjacent films. And what exactly do I mean by Giallo Adjacent? Just movies that share a lot of the traits of the Giallo film, but they were produced outside of Italy during the classic period or much later. I'm not sure if every single one of these films were directly influenced by Giallo films, but they probably pulled their influences from similar places. But, they're all kind of kindred spirits here. So without further ado, why don't we take a look at my top 10 Giallo adjacent films. Number 10 on my Giallo adjacent list is a film that deals with baseball. And I already know what you're thinking. What does baseball have to do with a Giallo film? Well, let me explain the premise of this movie. There's a killer that only murders people when a certain relief pitcher for the Houston Astros wins a night game at the Houston Astrodome. The movie I'm talking about is, well, Night Game. The film stars Roy Scheider of Jaws, Sorcerer, all that jazz fame, who's on the look for a killer, and if you want another hook for this movie, and yes, this bad pun is really intended, the killer has a hook for his hand, and that is the murder weapon. This is the kind of movie that you kind of stumble upon at 3 p.m. on TBS or TNT back in the 90s, and you just watch a couple minutes and you pretty much fall in and figure out the whole plot of the movie. I like this movie a lot, but what really cemented me loving this movie even more was when I screened it in February of 2023 as part of a series called Killer Obsession, which was kind of a series that was a little bit of a spillover from January Giallo. It was basically people who are obsessed with catching killers, and this was one of the movies. And incidentally enough, when I booked the 35mm print, it was a answer print that had been struck about 20 years ago, probably when MGM had originally done the DVD release of this movie, and had sat in a box at a print depot, and no one's ever booked it, no one's ever played it. I was the first person to literally play this 35mm in a movie theater, and the print looked pristine and just absolutely killed with an audience. So if you get a chance, check out Night Game, especially if you like baseball, Giallo films, and killers that have hooks for hands. Number 9 on my Giallo adjacent list is a film that stars Clint Eastwood playing a cop, and no, it's not part of the Dirty Harry series. It is a movie called Tightrope. As I already said, the movie stars Clint Eastwood. He plays a New Orleans cop who's a single dad raising his daughters, takes in all kinds of stray dogs, so he has like maybe 8, 10 of them or something ridiculous like that in the movie, and he's on the hunt for a sex crime murderer. And the twist here is that Clint has his own kinky vices, and the killer starts targeting people that are related to said kinky vices. This is completely different than most Clint Eastwood movies, and in a weird way, he's very vulnerable in it. Now, the movie is directed by Richard Tuggle, but according to most people, Richard moved a little too slow to Clint's liking, so Clint actually took over and started directing the movie. And there's a couple tells if you watch it. If you go and watch Sudden Impact, which was the Dirty Harry movie Clint Eastwood had starred and directed the year before this, they both opened with the same kind of like big helicopter shot over a city. There's a lot of Clint-isms in how this movie is shot. This is another movie that I ended up playing as part of my Killer Obsession series back in 2023 with Night Game, and incidentally enough, it also played as part of the Music Box's January Giallo series in 2023, and I actually flew out and was there in person to introduce that screening. Number 8 on my Giallo adjacent list was a film that was considered very controversial upon its release, and now is quite beloved by a lot of cinephiles. It is William Friedkin's Cruisin from 1980. It stars Al Pacino as a cop that goes deep cover, and I mean deep cover, into the gay leather underworld to catch a serial killer that's offing people in that scene. Originally, William Friedkin wanted Richard Gere to be the star of the movie, and I can kind of see why based on Gere's performances and things like Looking for Mr. Goodbar, but once Al Pacino became interested, the studio put him in, and then him and Friedkin had some conflict, and I think Al got very self-conscious and concerned about how he was being betrayed in the movie. But at the end of the day, I think Al gives a wonderful performance. And sure, he's been memed to death with that scene where he does a popper and he starts dancing, but that's only a small segment of this movie. The movie was protested while it was being shot by the gay community because they didn't like how they were being portrayed in the movie, and then the movie met all kinds of censorship issues when it went to go get a rating from the MPAA. Allegedly, 40 minutes of the movie got cut out, and Friedkin's kind of been giving mixed answers of what exactly was in that 40 minutes. But as it stands, Cruisin is a really terrific thriller. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Couple things I just want to note. The movie's loosely based on a book by Gerald Walker. However, Friedkin ended up pulling a lot of real life things into it. There was a series of murders called the Bag Murders that happened in the 70s in New York. The crime has never been solved, but basically someone was killing people, dismembering them, putting their body parts in trash bags and dumping them in the Hudson River for the police to find. Another thing I want to mention about the Gerald Walker book was that Brian De Palma originally wanted to option the book so he could make a movie out of it, but once he found out that Friedkin had it, he's like, well, I guess I gotta make something else, and more on that later on this list. At the number 7 spot on my Giallo Adjacent list is a movie from 2018. It's Jan Gonzalez's Knife Plus Heart. If you haven't seen this movie, a woman who works as a gay pornographer is basically upset that her longtime partner and editor of her films leaves her, so she decides to take on this ambitious project to kind of win her back. But while she's trying to make this film, one of her actors is murdered by a serial killer that uses, how do I word this without getting demonetized? A knife that is in a phallic thing. Yeah, we'll go. It's a phallic knife. Like literally how the knife has always been treated as like a phallic symbol in horror movies. It literally is that phallic symbol with a blade attached to it. This is a really terrific movie. It has a great score by M83, who's the brother of the director of this movie. This is one of my favorite like Neo Giallo. It's beautifully shot, lots of twists, and it actually would make a really good double feature with Cruisin. Number 6 on my Giallo Adjacent list is one of my favorite Neo Giallo films. It is 2007's I Know Who Killed Me, directed by Chris Severson and starring Lindsay Lohan. I know some of you are going to say, wasn't this movie given a bunch of Razzies and that kind of stuff and considered a bad movie? Don't believe any of this stuff. This is actually a really well done Neo Giallo. It has a great color scheme. The plotting is basically something out of a Umberto Lenzi or Sergio Martino movie. And in fact, if you take Lindsay Lohan out of the movie and replace it with Carol Baker or Edwidge Fenech and kind of demonetize and take like the basic story and put it in the 70s, it's a perfect example of a Giallo film. For those who haven't seen it, a vanished young woman apparently reappears, but swears up and down that she isn't the person everyone thinks she is. And there's some twists and some turns that I don't want to spoil because I think this is a really terrific example of Giallo logic played out full through American lens. I actually screened this as part of January Giallo 2023 with the director Chris Severson there in person. Kind of great to see the movie get appreciated with a sold out crowd and, you know, allow Chris to just kind of bask in the glory he was kind of denied when this movie came out. And if you've been on the fence or haven't want to see it because of all the bad word of mouth from back in the day, definitely give I Know Who Killed Me a chance. Personal favorite, and if you can see it in a big screen, there's no better feeling than watching Lindsay Lohan say the title of the movie out loud in a movie theater and hearing the audience reaction. It is one of my favorite cinema moments ever.
I Know Who Killed Me.
Riding in at the number 5 spot on my Giallo Adjacent list is a movie featuring a motorcycle helmet killer. I'm talking about Night School from 1981. For those who haven't seen it, women start turning up dead who have been attending a night school in Boston, and they're getting decapitated by someone, you know, as I already said, wearing a motorcycle helmet. My film programming colleagues and myself have been on the search to find a 35mm print so we can actually screen this one year for January Giallo, and so far we haven't found any materials other than the Blu-ray. It was also released under the title Terrorize, which is kind of funny. I guess they're talking about the victims terrorized because you can't see the killer's eyes because they have a motorcycle helmet on. But if you haven't seen it yet, pick up the Blu-ray. It's a lot of fun. It is a well-done American Giallo. And it's kind of a nice like Boston travelogue and makes for a great double feature with something like Pieces, you know, another Giallo adjacent horror movie set in Beantown. Number 4 on my Giallo adjacent list, we're about to have a religious experience with Alice Sweet Alice, aka Communion, aka Holy Terror. For those who haven't seen it, a young girl is murdered on the day of her communion, and a lot of people think it's her sister that killed her. But then when other bodies start turning up with a little girl, or what is believed to be a little girl dressed in a yellow raincoat and wearing a mask, you guessed it, Giallo hijinks ensues. This movie is from 1976 and is directed by Alfred Soul. Obviously with the yellow raincoat, it's kind of a nod to Don't Look Now and the little girl in the red raincoat, but this is an expertly made American Giallo. And just to hammer home the Giallo-ness or Giallo adjacentness of Alice Sweet Alice, check out this Italian poster I have of the movie. Several years ago, I had reached out to the director of Alice Sweet Alice, Alfred Soul, to see if he would come out and do a Q&A for a screening I was doing. He was very kind. He was going to try to make it out, but he was working as a production designer on a bunch of Marvel movies at the time and he couldn't get his schedule to work, but he was kind enough to record a pre-taped intro for my screening.
I'm so glad and amazed that Alice has a life of its own.
When the film opened in Los Angeles, the critic for the LA Times said it was an awful movie. Well, I guess maybe time has proven her wrong.
One last thing to note about Alice Sweet Alice, this was the debut of actor Brooke Shields, and in fact, once Brooke Shields became famous, a lot of the marketing behind the movie just focused on that, but if you've seen the movie, you know that's kind of a misleading thing. So classic inaccurate exploitation movie marketing right there. Number 3 on my Giallo Adjacent list, it stars Faye Dunaway, Tommy Lee Jones, Brad Dourif. I'm talking about The Eyes of Laura Mars. For those who haven't seen the movie, a fashion photographer who likes to shoot photos of sex and violence suddenly has the ability to see through the eyes of a killer and witnesses these horrible murders. This movie was originally written by John Carpenter. Yes, John Carpenter, who did Halloween, The Fog, The Thing. He had written the script and sold it to the studio. Studio hired on some other writers to change some things and punch it up. Carpenter said some very unflattering things about the finished movie, but I actually really enjoyed this a lot. Another fun fact that the original lead for this movie was supposed to be Barbra Streisand because her husband at the time, John Peters, was the producer on the movie. But although Babs does not appear in the movie, she did provide an original song for it. Number 2 on my Giallo Adjacent list is a film that takes place in Venice. However, it was not directed by an Italian filmmaker. It was actually directed by Nicholas Roeg, who directed things like Bad Timing, The Man Who Fell from Earth, Eureka, and Walkabout. This movie is Don't Look Now, starring Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland. This is one of the great psychological horror thrillers ever made. And for those who haven't seen it, a couple lose their daughter in a very tragic accident. They go to Venice because the husband is working on restoring a cathedral or church type thing while he's there. And they run into a lady that has psychic abilities and gives them a dire warning that something bad is coming. And while they're there, the husband starts having visions. He can see his daughter in a red raincoat running around the streets of Venice, and he's trying to catch her. This movie is very bleak and has one of the most unerotic, erotic sex scenes ever seen. It's actually a masterwork of montage editing. The film has an incredible score by Pino Donaggio, who actually scored other Giallo films. There's nothing else I really can say other than this movie's a heartbreaking masterpiece, and definitely check it out. And if you want to pair this with a Giallo film, definitely consider watching it with Who Saw Her Die. Both these movies share similar themes and would make for a great double feature. And at the number 1 spot on my Giallo Adjacent list is a film directed by Brian De Palma, who's definitely made a lot of Giallo Adjacent style films. I'm talking about 1980s Dressed to Kill.
Dressed to Kill. Michael Caine. Angie Dickinson. Nancy Allen.
As I hinted at earlier, when Brian De Palma wanted to option Gerald Walker's Cruisin to make a movie and he couldn't, he's like, well, I guess I gotta do something else. That something else ended up being Dressed to Kill. For those who haven't seen a movie, a psychiatrist's patient is killed by another one of his patients that has very homicidal tendencies, and the crime is witnessed by a high-class call girl. So the call girl teams up with the son of the victim to try to figure out who the murderer is. This is a perfect example of an American Giallo film. You get a black love killer, you get a straight razor, you get a great score by Pino Donaggio, who I already mentioned in Don't Look Now, and it's directed by Brian De Palma, whose films are very stylish and very visceral, just like a lot of Giallo films, so it just makes sense. When I was working on this list, I knew Brian De Palma was going to have the number 1 spot, and I was kind of torn between this one and Sisters, which is another great example of a Giallo adjacent film, but I went with Dressed to Kill because out of all of De Palma's films, it is the most classically Giallo because it meets all the tropes with murder set pieces, red herrings, and twists. Again, if you haven't seen this movie, definitely check it out. And lastly, I actually screened this as part of a January Giallo double feature in 2019 with Dario Argento's Tenebrae, and I had the pleasure of being able to do a Q&A with star Nancy Allen for this film. So that's my top 10 Giallo adjacent list. Sound off in the comments, tell me about your favorite Giallo adjacent films. I think this might be a list where I do another 10 because there's a lot of ones that I thought about and had in list and took out, things like Robert Altman's Images and Color of Night. So yeah, I think I might be doing a sequel, which is weird because normally there are no sequels in Giallo films. If you enjoyed this list, make sure you like and subscribe, and also check out the playlist with my other top 10 lists. Obviously, if you like Giallo films, the first one I did was top 10 Giallo films, and I just recently did an additional 10 Giallo film lists, so check those out. But for now, happy January Giallo, and until next time, see you in the void.
We got a murder weapon with a nice set of your prints on it.
Hey, that's bullshit. Why would I want to kill her?
You were there with the razor, you tell me.